The morning I found out my husband was cheating on me, I was wearing my good coat, the camel wool one I saved 3 months for, and carrying a handwritten sign that said, "Welcome home, Mom and Dad," in red marker, because my mother always cried when she saw things like that. I was standing near the arrivals gate at Terminal B, watching the sliding doors open and close, thinking about nothing more complicated than whether to take them to dinner first or straight home. And then the doors opened, and instead of my parents, I saw my husband kissing a woman who was not me. He didn't see me. That was the first gift the universe gave me that day. Igor had his back mostly turned, his hand on the small of her back in that particular way, proprietary, comfortable, practiced. And she was laughing at something he'd said, her head tilted back, 26 years old if she was a day, with the kind of hair that takes 90 minutes and a professional to achieve. He was supposed to be in Novosibirsk. He'd texted me that morning, "Landing soon, miss you, eat something," and I had made a note to pick up his dry cleaning on Wednesday. I had been, until approximately 11:47 on a Thursday morning, a woman who made notes about dry cleaning. My father found me 40 seconds later. He'd come out a different exit with my mother, and he read my face the way he always had. The way he'd read balance sheets for 30 years as a regional budget administrator. Quickly, completely, without sentiment. He took the sign from my hands. He steered my mother toward the coffee stand with a quiet word I didn't hear. And then he came back to me and stood beside me, and we both watched Igor pull away from her and check his phone and smile and say something that made her laugh again. And then she walked toward the domestic terminal, and he walked toward the exit, and he never looked in our direction once. My father said quietly, "Well," and I said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the situation hadn't already said perfectly. But I need to go back, because none of this started at the airport, and if I tell you it started there, I'm lying to you the way Igor lied to me, by omission, by emphasis, by leaving out the parts that explain everything. Igor Menshov and I met at a corporate seminar on risk assessment 6 years ago, which should have told me something right there. He was presenting a case study on his company, Mensch Home, a chain of home goods stores, 7 locations across the city and 2 in the suburbs. And he was very good at it. Confident without being aggressive, funny in the right places. He had a way of making a room feel like they were in on something with him, like he was sharing a secret. And I remember thinking that he would be either very successful or very dangerous, and that the line between the two was thinner than people like to admit. I thought I was being perceptive. I was not being perceptive. We started dating 4 months later. I was 31, established in my career at Meridian Consulting, financial control, audit support, the unglamorous work of finding the number that doesn't belong, and not particularly looking for anything. He was charming in the way that requires effort, which I initially read as sincerity. He remembered things. He asked follow-up questions. He brought me books based on things I'd mentioned in passing, and they were always exactly right, which meant he'd actually listened, or he was very good at a particular kind of performance. I have spent considerable time in the months since deciding which it was. We were married 2 years later. Small ceremony. My parents flew in from Ekaterinburg. His mother gave a toast that was primarily about Igor and only incidentally about me, which I found slightly odd and filed away under things to think about later. My father gave me a bracelet that had belonged to his mother, thin gold, a single amber stone, and he clasped it on my wrist himself and said, "Tepla, ticha. You are the smartest person in this family, Nadenka. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." I wore it every day. I still do. We bought an apartment. I bought an apartment, technically, with money my father and I had both contributed to over years, and it was structured as a gift from him to me, which meant it was mine outright, legally and unambiguously, a fact that would later become extraordinarily relevant. Igor moved in with his good suits and his protein powder and his very large television, and we were, for approximately the first 2 years, genuinely happy. Or I was happy. I cannot speak to his interior life, which it turns out I knew considerably less about than I thought. The apartment was on the 8th floor of a building in a decent neighborhood, with windows that faced east and got the morning light, and I had a whole system for the mornings. Coffee first, then the news on my laptop, then 30 minutes of whatever I was reading, then the commute. Igor was not a morning person, and he would emerge at 8:30 looking affronted by the existence of daylight, and I would hand him a cup of coffee without commentary, and he would drink it standing at the window and slowly become human. It was, in retrospect, one of the genuinely nice things about our life together. He was very annoying before coffee and very endearing after it, and I liked that I knew this about him. I liked knowing things about the people I loved. His mother, Raisa Petrovna, visited once a month and stayed for the weekend, which I also filed under things to think about later. She was a small woman with large opinions and the peculiar habit of rearranging my kitchen every time she came. Not maliciously, or perhaps maliciously, it's hard to say, but with the confident certainty that she knew better where the cutting boards should live. She never said anything overtly cruel to me. She was much cleverer than that. She worked by omission and implication, by the slight pause before answering a question, by the way she would say, "Well, every family is different," in response to anything she disapproved of. She made Igor's favorite dishes when she visited, and left the recipes on the counter in her handwriting, which was a very specific kind of message, and I received it clearly. I want to be fair. In those first 2 years, the warning signs were quiet. They were the kind of thing you notice and dismiss. Igor's business was, he said, going through a restructuring period. He was optimistic about it. He was always optimistic about it, in the way that people are optimistic about things they are choosing not to look at directly. He mentioned, occasionally, that a joint account would make things easier, for tax purposes, for simplicity. I said we could look into it. I did not look into it. I am a financial controller. I have seen what joint accounts look like in divorce proceedings, and I was not ready to have that particular thought consciously, so I kept it filed away in the back where I put things I wasn't ready to look at. The first time I noticed something wrong with the numbers was about 18 months into our marriage. Igor had mentioned a supplier deal he was excited about, a new line of Scandinavian-style storage systems. He said they were going to be huge. And I happened to see a credit statement on his desk. Not snooping, just passing, just glancing, just the automatic financial brain reflex of a person who reads numbers for a living. The balance was higher than I expected. Much higher. I made a mental note. I didn't ask. That was my mistake, and I know it, and I've thought about it more times than is probably healthy. I didn't ask because asking would have made it real, and I didn't want it to be real. I wanted to be a person whose marriage was fine. I was very good at that particular want for a surprisingly long time. Scrabble night was every other Wednesday. 4 of us, me, Rita Basova, Lena Sorokina, and Polina Zhuravlyova. Rita and I had gone to university together. She'd been corporate law for 8 years before deciding, as she put it, that billing by the hour is a beautiful concept until you do it for long enough that the hours blur into a gray paste, and had left the firm 2 years ago to be home with her kids, which she described as arguably harder and significantly less paid. Lena was an architect, and Polina ran a florist shop that she'd inherited from her aunt and expanded to 3 locations, which she described not as running a business, but as waging a personal war against ugly arrangements. We played at Lena's apartment because it had the best table. We drank wine, usually one bottle split 4 ways, and then a second split however it went. We had been doing this for 4 years. It was, if I'm honest, the most reliably good thing in my life during the year things with Igor started going wrong, and I didn't fully appreciate that until later. It was Polina who noticed first. Polina always noticed. She had the florist's eye for wilt, for the thing that looks fine until you look at it a certain way, and then you see it's been dying for a while. She put down an H on a triple-letter tile, building off Rita's quince, and said without looking up, "Nadenka, you've had votive on your rack for 3 turns." "I'm thinking," I said. "You're not thinking," Polina said pleasantly. "You're somewhere else entirely. What happened?" "Nothing happened." Rita looked up from her tiles. Lena refilled her glass. The 3 of them watched me with the particular patience of women who have known each other long enough to wait. "Igor asked me to co-sign on a business loan," I said finally. "A significant one." Silence. "How significant?" Rita said. "Significant enough that he wants to use my apartment as secondary collateral." More silence. Polina carefully placed her tiles. "Myth, 17 points. Nadia," Rita said slowly, "you know I'm not practicing anymore, but I do remember enough to tell you that that's not something you do lightly." "I know." "What does your father say?" "I haven't told him." Lena made a sound that was not quite a word. Polina refilled my wine. Rita looked at me steadily across the board and said, "Well, let me ask you something, and you don't have to answer. Is the business actually doing well?" I said nothing for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car passed. "I don't know," I said, "and that's the problem." The thing about being a financial controller is that you are professionally trained to follow the money. You know exactly which questions to ask, exactly where the soft spots in a balance sheet are, exactly what a company looks like when it's being held together with tape and optimism and new debt used to service old debt. I knew all of this. I had known all of this for 12 years, and I had been deliberately not applying it to my own marriage because applying it would have required me to know things I wasn't ready to know. After Scrabble that night, I sat in the car for 11 minutes before driving home. I did the math in my head, not precisely, just the shape of it. Igor's stores were 9 now. He'd opened 2 more last year, rapid expansion, while the underlying numbers, the numbers I'd half seen, the numbers I'd refused to look at directly, suggested that the existing stores weren't performing well enough to justify it. New debt to fund new locations not generating enough to service the debt. Classic. I'd seen it in audits a dozen times. I'd written reports about it. I'd never been married to it before. I drove home. Igor was on the couch watching football. He smiled when I came in, genuinely, or very convincingly, and asked if I wanted tea. I said no. I went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to him move around in the kitchen and thought, I need to know the actual numbers. I called my father the next morning. My father, Stanislav Alexievich Vlasov, had spent 23 years as a regional budget administrator, which is a job that sounds boring until you understand what it actually means. He controlled where the money went, which means he knew where the money was, which means he knew where the money wasn't, which means he knew everything about everyone who needed something from the regional government. He had since retired and consulted informally for several commercial entities who valued his particular type of institutional knowledge. He was 63 years old. He was patient in the way that very effective people are patient. Not because he was calm, but because he understood that timing is the most important variable in any confrontation. I told him what I knew. I told him about the loan request, the apartment as collateral, the numbers I'd half seen and refused to look at. I heard him listen. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said, Rovna, bez emocji. How long do you need to look at the full picture? 2 weeks, maybe 3. You know Arkady Semin? I know of him. He's good. He's discreet. I'll send you his number. Call him today. Papa, yes? I didn't finish the sentence. He waited. What if it's bad? I said finally. Then we deal with bad, he said. But you don't make decisions without numbers, Nadenka. You know that. That's who you are. I hung up and looked out the window at the east-facing light that I'd loved when we bought the apartment. When I bought the apartment, correction, my apartment, and thought, yes, that's who I am. I'd forgotten, briefly. I remembered now. Arkady Semin was 50, small, bespectacled, and had the particular energy of a man who had seen every possible way a business could fail and found it professionally interesting rather than depressing. He met me at a cafe near my office, ordered an Americano, set a notepad on the table, and said, "Tell me what you know and what you don't know, in that order." I spent an hour telling him both. He wrote things down and asked questions that were clean and specific, the kind of questions that tell you the person asking them already knows the territory. When I was done, he capped his pen and said, "Give me 10 days. What's your initial read?" He looked at me over his glasses. My initial read is that you are a financially literate woman who has been very carefully not applying her skills to a situation that deserved them. My professional read comes in 10 days. I respected him immediately and entirely. What Arkady found in 10 days was worse than I'd expected, which was saying something because I'd expected it to be bad. Menchhome, Igor's company, 9 stores, the thing he'd been building for 8 years and describing as his life's work, was, in Arkady's precise and devastating language, a liquidity crisis being managed through sequential refinancing. In plain language, the stores weren't profitable, hadn't been meaningfully for at least 3 years. Every time a loan came due, Igor took out a new loan to pay it. The new locations he'd opened last year were funded entirely by debt, secured against the older stores, which were themselves not generating enough to service the original debt load. It was a structure that required constant new money to survive. New money, or, and here was the part that made the coffee in my mouth turn cold, a significant injection of outside capital. Outside capital. Like, say, a co-signed loan, secured against a mortgage-free apartment belonging to a wife with a stable, documented income. He was planning to use you as the exit, Arkady said, not unkindly, sliding the printed summary across the table to me. Not permanently, or possibly permanently. It depends on how optimistic we're being about his ability to turn the business around. And I am personally not very optimistic. I looked at the numbers. They looked exactly like numbers I'd written reports about. Exactly like numbers that end badly. How long before it collapses on its own, I asked. Without new capital, 6 months. Maybe 8 if he's creative. But he's not generating enough to service the debt. You can see on page 3 the coverage ratio. I see it, I said. I see all of it. I sat there for a moment. The cafe was warm and smelled like coffee and someone's lunch, an ordinary life continuing as it had no idea it needed to. One more question, I said. Is there any scenario in which his business is viable? Any legitimate path? Arkady considered this with the seriousness it deserved. If he consolidated 3 years ago, closed the underperforming locations, restructured the debt, focused on the profitable stores? Possibly. He has 2 stores that actually work, Stavropolskaya and the Leninsky location. But that window is closed. He expanded instead of consolidating. He spent money he didn't have on growth he couldn't sustain. He paused. Someone convinced him, or he convinced himself, that he could grow his way out of the problem. That almost never works. He convinced himself, I said, and was surprised by how certain I was. That's exactly who he is. I paid for the coffee. I put the folder in my bag. I walked out into the afternoon and called my father. It's what we thought, I said. Worse in some numbers. Where are you? Outside the cafe on Pushkinskaya. Come for dinner. Don't go home yet. Your mother wants to feed you, and I want to talk through the options. Can you do that? Yes, I said. Papa, how did you know? Before I even looked. How did you know it would be bad? A pause. The sounds of his apartment in the background. My mother's television, something simmering. Because a man who loves a woman doesn't ask her to risk her home, he said. That's all. That's the whole of it. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The sun was doing something lovely with the buildings across the street, and I noticed it, and I thought, I am going to remember this moment. Not because it was good, but because it was the moment I stopped pretending. I should tell you about my mother, because she is part of this story in a way she doesn't know I know. Her name is Irina. She is warm and practical and makes excellent soup and has been known, periodically, to see things she finds more convenient to not have seen. This is not cruelty. It is a particular type of love, the love that wants everything to be all right more than it wants to know whether everything is all right. I understand it. I even share it to a degree. It's part of why I waited so long to look at the numbers. My father told me, 3 weeks after the airport, in his even, administrative voice, that my mother had seen Igor with Vlada at a company event 18 months ago. Not kissing, just together in a way that didn't look like colleagues. She had, he said, decided not to say anything because she wasn't certain and because she didn't want to cause problems and because she was sure I would figure it out myself eventually. My father told me this and then sat quietly and let me process it. She should have told me, I said. Yes, he said simply. No defense, no mitigation. Just yes. She knows that now. I didn't talk to my mother about it for 2 weeks. Then I did, and she cried, and I said I forgave her, and I mostly meant it, and we agreed not to discuss it again. This is also a type of love, the kind that prioritizes the ongoing relationship over the complete accounting. My father's approach and my mother's approach are different, and I contain elements of both, which I think is actually useful when you're trying to survive something. But that came later. First, there was Igor. Igor came home that Thursday, the Thursday of the airport, in good spirits. His flight from not Novosibirsk, arriving from wherever Vlada Soldatova was based. He'd texted me at 2 that the meetings had run long. He'd texted me again at 5 that he was heading to the airport. All of it perfectly ordinary, perfectly documented, perfectly false. I made dinner. Pasta, simple, the kind I make on autopilot. He talked about the trip, meetings, he said, suppliers interested in expanding the contract, positive signs for the Leninsky location. All of it fluent and detailed and completely manufactured. And I ate my pasta and listened and asked a question or two and watched him with the new eyes I'd had since 11:47 that morning. And I thought, he's very good at this. He had been doing this for long enough to be very good at this. After dinner, he poured himself a whiskey and settled on the couch and asked if I wanted to watch something, and I said I was tired and went to bed. And I lay there in the dark and thought, how long? How long has he been doing this? I didn't sleep until 3. Then I did, hard and dreamless, the way you sleep when your body finally gives out from holding something. The next morning I got up and made coffee and put his cup on the counter without looking at him, and he said, "Good morning, sunshine." And I said good morning and went to sit by the window with my coffee and my book and my brand new, perfectly organized, completely devastating understanding of my own life. He asked about the loan again that weekend. He'd been building to it for weeks, laying the groundwork with the language of partnership, of we and us and together, of this is our family's future, Nadia. And now he was ready for the close. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with the papers he'd prepared, and he explained the structure, and he watched my face for the response he expected, which was some version of concerned but loving wife who needs to be reassured. I looked at the papers. They were, from a technical standpoint, exactly as catastrophic as Arkady had described. The interest rate was aggressive. The collateral clause was standard but devastating in context. If the business defaulted, which it was going to do, the apartment would be at risk. My apartment. The apartment my father and I had bought together. The apartment that contained my east-facing windows and my careful morning routine and the last 11 years of my adult life. "Let me think about it," I said. He smiled, relieved, encouraged. "Of course, take your time. I just want you to know that this is the path forward, for both of us. This is how we build something together." I looked at him across the table. He was very handsome, Igor, in a solid, well-maintained way. Good jaw. Warm eyes that knew how to be warm. I had loved him, I was almost certain of it, and the certainty was almost gone now, and what was left in its place was a very clear, very cold, very precise understanding of the situation. "I'll let you know," I said. He patted my hand. He went to make more coffee. I sat at the table and looked at the papers and thought, you want to use my home to pay for your mistakes. You have been sleeping with someone else. You have been lying to me for what appears to be several years. And you are currently making coffee in my kitchen and expecting me to sign these papers. I folded the papers carefully. I put them in the file. I did not sign anything. The second Scrabble night after the airport happened on a Wednesday evening in early November. Lena's apartment smelled like fresh paint. She'd been redoing the hallway. And Polina had brought those little chocolate-covered figs that everyone pretended weren't the main reason we kept coming back. I told them everything. Not all at once, piece by piece, across the first glass of wine, while Rita sorted her tiles and Polina arranged her rack with the precise aesthetic attention she applied to everything, and Lena sat cross-legged on the floor because she'd been sitting in the chair for 8 hours and her back hurt. I told them about the airport and the loan and Arkady's report and my father's involvement and the bracelet that was specifically not for sale. When I finished, there was a particular silence. The kind that means everyone has plenty to say and is deciding what order to say it in. Lena spoke first. Suka, blyad. 9 years, Nadezhda? 6 married, 9 including dating. Oh my God. Lena picked up her wine, put it down, picked it up again. He sat at this table. He ate my homemade pelmeni. He said they were the best he'd ever had. They probably were, Polina said mildly. This doesn't reflect well on his character, not his taste. I am so angry, Lena said. I am so incredibly angry on your behalf right now. Can I be angry? You seem very calm, and I need someone to be angry. Please, I said, I've used up my angry. You hold some for me. Rita had been quiet, her lawyer's brain clearly running calculations. She put down blunt on the board, triple word score, and said, "Okay, what's the actual plan? Not the emotional plan, the actual plan. Does he know you know?" "No." "Good. And your father is involved?" "He's coordinating." "Arkady has the full picture?" "On paper, yes." Rita nodded slowly. "The apartment is clean? Fully in your name? Gift deed? No joint claim?" "Completely." "Then the divorce is straightforward, from a property standpoint. It's his debts that are the issue. You need to make sure there's no way he claims you were joint partners in the business." "I was never a partner. I'm not on any documents." "Check all the documents," Rita said. "Every single one. Arkady should flag anything with your name on it that you didn't explicitly sign. Because if there's something—" "There won't be," I said. "He was careful not to involve me legally. Probably because he planned to get my signature later, voluntarily, when he'd softened me up enough." Polina made a sound that was not a word. "He thought you were soft," she said. "He thought you were the kind of woman who can be softened up." "Yes," I said. "Well." Polina picked up her tiles, placed sharp on the board. 14 points. "His mistake." Lena laughed, a short, bright, genuine laugh, and topped up everyone's wine. And Rita wrote down a list of things to check, and we played Scrabble for another 2 hours. And by the time I drove home, something in me that had been wound very tight for 3 weeks had loosened by approximately 1 turn. I still didn't have a plan, but I had my father and Arkady and 3 women who were now, technically, furious on my behalf, which turns out to be a resource not to be underestimated. The bracelet conversation happened on a Sunday. Igor had been escalating. The loan papers were still on his desk. He'd moved them there, a passive-aggressive geography. I noticed him notice whether I noticed. And the conversations had gotten more urgent, more loaded with we and us and our future. The week before, he'd mentioned that his investors were getting nervous. The week before that, he'd said something about the Novosibirsk contacts having more options than originally discussed. He was applying pressure in small increments, the way you turn up heat slowly enough that someone doesn't notice they're being cooked. On Sunday morning, I was at the kitchen table with my coffee, and he sat down across from me with the particular body language of a man who has prepared what he's going to say. I recognized it. I'd seen it in presentations, in performance reviews, in contract negotiations. The squared shoulders, the even breathing, the rehearsed casualness. "Snadya, I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to really hear me." "I'm listening," I said. "The business is at a critical point. You know that. And I've been looking at every option." He paused, looked at my hands, at the bracelet. "Your father's bracelet." I looked up at him. He was watching my face very carefully, looking for the right moment to deliver the second part of the sentence. "I know it means a lot to you, but we could get a significant amount for it, and combined with what we'd get from the loan—" The coffee cup was in my hand. I set it down, very carefully. The ceramic made a small sound against the table. "No," I said. "Nadia, no." The word was not loud. It didn't need to be. The bracelet stays. The apartment is not collateral, and I'm not signing anything. He stared at me. I watched the shift, the warmth dropping away, the calculation underneath becoming briefly visible. "I'm not asking you to lose anything." "I know what you're asking, and the answer is no." I picked up my coffee. "I'd like you to stop asking." He left the table. He was careful not to slam anything. He showered, dressed, went out, said he was meeting someone about a supplier contract. I watched him leave and then sat alone in the apartment for a long time, looking at the east-facing light on the wall, thinking about how a person can know something for months and still not feel it completely until the exact right moment. The bracelet was my father's mother's. He'd told me the story once. She'd received it from her own mother in Leningrad before the war, hidden it through the siege, kept it across everything. Not worth much financially, worth everything structurally. Igor had looked at it and seen a number. That was the last piece of information I needed. I called my father. He asked about the bracelet. A pause. "All right," my father said. "Then we're moving." What my father and Arkady did, I want to be precise about. They didn't sabotage anything. They didn't plant information or manufacture crises or do anything that could be characterized fairly as underhanded. What they did was stop helping Igor hide. Igor's investors, he had two significant ones, men who'd put money into Menchhome's expansion phase, had been receiving his quarterly reports. Those reports were, Arkady confirmed, optimistic to the point of fiction. Not outright fraudulent, technically, Igor was careful, but shaped and framed and presented in ways that emphasized the positive and buried the negative in footnotes written to not be understood by non-specialists. My father knew one of the investors. They'd had professional dealings years before. He called him, not to make accusations, just to suggest that it might be worth having an independent financial review before committing to the next round. A friendly word, professional courtesy. That investor called the other investor. The other investor hired his own analyst. The analyst looked at the actual numbers, not the shaped and framed version, and delivered a report that used the phrase unsustainable debt structure and significant default risk, and in one memorable passage, fundamental mismatch between expansion rate and underlying performance. And then there was the investor meeting. Igor had arranged it himself. He needed to buy time, to convince them to hold their positions while he arranged the new financing he'd been expecting from me. The meeting was at a hotel conference room, which I know because Arkady told me afterward, and because my father attended. He'd been invited by the first investor, who was growing understandably nervous. I was not there. I didn't need to be. I was at work, doing the job I'd been doing for 12 years, the one that pays well because it's useful and requires real skill and is not structurally collapsing. The meeting went, apparently, very badly for Igor. He'd prepared a presentation, full slides, professional design, the kind of thing that costs money and takes time and signals to its audience that the person presenting takes this seriously. He showed it with his usual fluency. Igor was always good in a room. It was the core of his professional skill, that ability to be the most confident and comfortable person in a conversation. And he walked them through the expansion strategy, the new locations, the market opportunity in the home goods segment, the projected returns. And then the investor's analyst asked a question. Specifically, the coverage ratio on page 3 didn't reconcile with the interest expense line in the 12-month summary. Could he walk through that? Igor walked through it. The analyst asked a follow-up. And then the second investor's analyst, because the second investor had also brought someone, which apparently Igor hadn't expected, asked about the inventory turnover figures, which implied a sales velocity that seemed inconsistent with the foot traffic data from the 2 stores they'd independently checked. There was a pause. Igor explained. He was good at explaining. He could make numbers sound like a narrative, which is a skill that works beautifully until you're in a room with people who are specifically there to turn the narrative back into numbers. The analyst from the first investor said, "Rovna professionalna." And the Novosibirsk expansion costs, these are recorded as capitalized development expenses. But the supplier contracts we've been able to review suggest they were closer to operating expenses. Can you help me understand the accounting treatment? Another pause. Longer this time. My father, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, invited by the first investor, introduced as a retired budget administrator with relevant sector experience, said nothing. He simply watched. He had not said a word in 40 minutes. He had a glass of water in front of him that he had not touched. He was, Arkady told me later, the stillest person in the room by a significant margin, and several people had glanced at him several times, trying to read him, and found nothing to read. Igor made his case. He talked about growth trajectories. He talked about the Stavropolskaya and Leninsky locations as proof of the model's viability. He talked about the new financing he was arranging, a restructured debt package, he said, with strong terms that would bridge the current period and position the company for the next phase. At this point, my father set down his water glass, very gently. The small sound was, apparently, quite audible in the silence that had settled over the table. And then he said, "Rovna, bez всякой злости. The Stavropolskaya location and the Leninsky store appear viable. The rest is, as far as I can see, decorative." He said it the way you observe a fact, not with malice, not with triumph, with the professional neutrality of a man who has been looking at numbers for 30 years and knows exactly what they mean, and has no particular reason to pretend otherwise. Igor looked at him. For the first time in the presentation, he looked at him directly. My father met his eyes and said nothing further. The investors thanked him and said they'd be in touch. They were not in touch. They were in touch with their lawyers. There was an inventory visit. This is the part of the story that I tell Rita and Paulina and Lena, and they lose it every time, and I have to wait for them to compose themselves before I can continue. So I'll tell you, and if you laugh, I understand. But please understand, it also felt like a metaphor so precise that the universe itself was making a point. When Arkady did his initial site visits to assess the business assets, he went to all 9 locations. He came back with a comprehensive report, and buried in the inventory section of the Leninsky store, the good one, the profitable one, was a note that made him send me a text that said simply, "Call me when you're alone." I called. He said, "I want to prepare you for something. In the Leninsky warehouse, there is a standing inventory line item that's been there for 18 months. What is it? 412 garden gnomes." I'm sorry? Garden gnomes, ceramic, traditional design. He ordered a bulk lot from a Czech supplier. Apparently there was a trend forecast that didn't pan out, and they have been sitting in the warehouse. They are on the books at acquisition value. They are not selling. The clearance events, he ran 3, moved 11 units combined. I sat with this information for a moment. 412, Arkady confirmed. They are taking up a significant amount of floor space and contributing nothing to revenue. I mention it because it is listed as an asset, and I want you to understand what kind of assets we are dealing with. I thought about this. I thought about Igor's presentation slides, his expansion vision, his strategic pillars and growth trajectories. I thought about 412 garden gnomes sitting in a warehouse. "Thank you, Arkady," I said. "Of course." I didn't laugh then, but later, alone in the apartment, I did. I laughed for a long time. Not meanly, or maybe a little meanly, but mostly because there is something about the specificity of 412 garden gnomes that is genuinely, cosmically funny.
All of his ambition and his loans and his carefully maintained optimism. And underneath it, anchoring the whole thing like the world's least intimidating ballast, 412 ceramic garden gnomes that no one wanted. I told Lena about the gnomes at the next Scrabble night. Lena had to put down her wine because she was afraid of spilling it. Rita made a sound that I can only describe as a professional, trying very hard not to be inappropriate. Paulina placed the word gnome on the board. She'd been holding it, she said. It was worth 11 points, and she wasn't going to waste the opportunity, and said, "Swell, at least they have good taste in lawn ornaments." 412 of them, I said. 412, Paulina agreed. A very thorough mistake. We played until midnight. It was the best Scrabble night we'd had in a year. I want to tell you about the night before I filed, because that night matters, and I don't want to skip it to get to the satisfying part, because the satisfying part only satisfies if you've earned it. It was a Tuesday.
Igor was at a supplier meeting, a real one, I think, one of his increasingly desperate efforts to restructure terms. He'd told me about it at breakfast with his usual fluency. The Krasnoyarsk contacts were interested in a distribution arrangement. There were promising conversations happening. He'd be back by 9. He was, I noticed, still running the whole performance. The optimistic updates, the strategic language, the implication that he was managing something large and important. Even now, even after the investors had pulled back and the refinancing had stalled, and I'd been quietly not signing anything for 6 weeks. Either he hadn't understood yet what was happening, or he was hoping to maintain the performance long enough to change the ending. I wasn't sure which, and I'd stopped trying to figure him out from the inside. That was the whole point. I was alone in the apartment. I'd ordered food, Georgian delivery, the place on Sovetskaya that I liked and he didn't, and I ate maybe a third of it, sitting at the kitchen table with Arkady's full report spread out in front of me and the divorce papers to the right, in the folder Rita had sent over with a note that said, "Reviewed, clean, call me if anything needs adjusting." Also, I have very good feelings about Zephyr on a triple-word tile if you have one. I looked at the papers for a long time. There's a particular feeling to a document that changes things. I knew it professionally. I'd handled the paperwork in dozens of situations where a number on a page meant something real to real people. But knowing it intellectually and being the person sitting across from the paperwork are two different experiences, and I wanted to be honest about that, at least to myself, in my own kitchen on a Tuesday night when there was no one to be professionally calm for. I put on the kettle. I stood at the window while it boiled. The city was doing what cities do at 8:30 on a weeknight, lit up and moving and indifferent to my particular situation, which I found both lonely and oddly comforting. The apartment building across the street had someone's laundry still on the balcony, damp and forgotten. On the 4th floor, a television flickered blue, life continuing, life not pausing to acknowledge that mine was at a particular kind of hinge point. I thought about the morning I'd moved in. 6 years ago, early spring, still cold enough for a jacket, Igor carrying boxes with the cheerful determination of a man who was very pleased with himself for choosing well. I remembered thinking, watching him maneuver the bookshelf through the door, that I was happy. Not in an overwhelming way. I was not, have never been, a person for whom happiness is overwhelming, but in the quiet, specific way of, this is good, this is correct, I chose correctly. I thought about the east-facing windows and how I'd discovered them on the first morning, the light coming in at exactly the right angle, warming the kitchen table, turning the coffee gold, and how I'd thought, this apartment is going to be mine. Not in an excluding way, not shutting anyone out, just the settled feeling of, this is where I belong. And then how, over 6 years, that feeling had gotten complicated and conditional and finally theoretical, and how I needed it to be simple again. The kettle clicked off. I made tea. I sat back down at the table. I opened Arkadiy's folder, not to check anything, but to sit with it, to stop, for one night, being the professional, calm version of myself, and let the other version, the one who had been in an airport on a Thursday and seen a particular hand on a particular back, actually be present with what this was. It had been a long performance, not Igor's performance, mine. The performance of a woman who was fine, who was figuring it out, who was handling the situation with admirable competence. I had been very good at it for 3 months. Excellent, actually. Arkadiy had commented on my focus. Rita had said I was the most organized person she'd ever worked with in circumstances like these, which was saying something given her years in corporate law. My father had simply said, in his way, that he was proud of me. But it was a Tuesday night, and I was alone, and the papers were on the table, and I let myself stop performing for a while. It hurt. That's what I want to tell you, plainly, without dressing it up. It wasn't clean, and it wasn't triumphant. Not yet. That was coming, but not yet. On that Tuesday night, it was just the weight of it. 6 years. The bookshelf through the door, the coffee in the morning light, the way he'd asked follow-up questions in the early years, the books he'd remembered, the genuine moments, and I believe some of them were genuine. I'm not revising all of it into darkness. Mixed up with and inseparable from the calculation, the debt, the airport, Vlada's laugh, 412 garden gnomes, my grandmother's bracelets suggested as a liquidity solution. He'd looked at me and seen a resource. A smart, stable, well-documented resource with good credit and an unencumbered property asset. He'd also, I think, seen a woman he was fond of, in the way that people are fond of the things that are useful to them. These two things coexisted in him, and he apparently saw no contradiction in that, which told me something important about how he understood the world. What made me angry, finally, actually angry, sitting at the kitchen table at 11:15 on a Tuesday, was the miscalculation, the specific professional insult of it. He had looked at Nadezhda Vlasova, financial controller, 12 years in audit and risk assessment, and concluded that she could be managed, that the right combination of warmth and partnership language and incremental pressure would get her to the signature, that she would not, in the end, apply to her own life the skills she applied every day to everyone else's. He'd miscalculated, and I was, in some very particular and not entirely rational way, more offended by the inaccuracy than the intent. I sat with that for a while. I looked at Arkadiy's numbers one more time. Then I closed the folder. I went and stood at the east-facing window, the night city, the forgotten laundry, the blue television on the 4th floor still going. I put my hand on the glass and it was cold and clear and mine. Then I went to bed. I lay there in the dark and listened to the apartment settle around me, pipes, a neighbor's footstep, the faint hum of the city, and thought, tomorrow. Tomorrow, this becomes the next thing. I slept. 7 hours, solid and dreamless, which still surprises me when I think about it. Some part of me had been waiting for that night, and when it came, something let go. I got up in the morning, made coffee, sat by the east-facing window, watched the light come in. Then I filed. I want to tell you what happened when Igor found out, because I will not lie and say I wasn't there for it, or that I wasn't paying attention. Arkadiy's recommendation had been to serve the papers while Igor was in a semi-public setting, not to cause a scene, but to prevent one. which is to say, if he's in a hotel lobby or a cafe, he is much less likely to escalate than if he's at home, which was also my home and which I needed to continue living in. The papers were served at the hotel where he'd had the investor meeting. Apparently, it was quick. Apparently, Igor said nothing for a long moment and then asked the server to confirm that these were divorce papers and not some kind of error. The server confirmed that they were. He called me 20 minutes later. I let it ring. I was at work. I was in the middle of something. He called 7 more times that afternoon. I didn't answer. At 4:30, I sent a text. Please communicate through lawyers going forward. Mine is Rita Basova. You know her. The detail that Rita had been our mutual acquaintance, that she'd been at my Scrabble table for 4 years, was something I'd thought about. I decided it was fair, possibly slightly satisfying, definitely fair. Rita told me later that Igor's lawyer called her within the hour and that the conversation was, professionally speaking, interesting. Igor had apparently prepared a list of grievances and assets and claims that assumed the apartment was marital property, which it was not. The gift deed made it clearly, legally, unambiguously mine, and which his lawyer had to gently but firmly explain to him was not a viable position. He called my father that evening. This was, in retrospect, a miscalculation even larger than the original one. My father picked up on the third ring. Igor said, I am told, something about family and about this not being what he would have expected and about not being treated fairly. My father let him finish. Then my father said, Rovna, holodna, absolutna bez zlosti. My grandfather had a saying, never borrow from someone smarter than you. You borrowed something worse than money from my daughter. You borrowed her trust. A pause. She's done lending. He hung up. My father called me afterward and relayed this, word for word, with no particular emphasis. I sat with my phone for a moment. Ticha, s chustvom. Papa, yes. Thank you. Tiepla, kratka. Come for dinner on Sunday. Your mother is making the thing with the mushrooms. I'll be there. The business collapsed in the way that Arkady had predicted it would. Not dramatically, but progressively, with the specific mechanical failure of something that has been overstressed for too long. The investors withdrew. The refinancing fell through. 3 of the underperforming stores closed within 60 days, then 2 more. The creditors began the process. The good stores, Stavrovolskaya and Leninsky, were eventually sold as part of the proceedings. Igor, I heard through the indirect channels that carry this kind of news, was negotiating with the creditors from a position of essentially no leverage. Vlada Soldatova, according to a mutual acquaintance who told Polina, who told me, had moved on to a developer from Krasnodar. Polina relayed this with the specific facial expression of someone presenting a data point they find aesthetically satisfying. Absolutно невозмутимо. He has, apparently, actual assets, Polina said, unlike our friend, the gnome merchant. Stop calling him that, I said. I will not, Polina said pleasantly. The divorce was finalized 4 months after I filed. It was, as Rita had predicted, relatively straightforward from a property standpoint. I kept the apartment, I kept the bracelet, I kept the east-facing windows and the morning light and the coffee routine and the careful, quiet life I'd been building since before Igor Menshov sat across a conference room from me and looked like someone worth knowing. He did not keep much. The creditors were thorough. There was one last conversation. I hadn't planned it, and I almost didn't have it. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I was coming out of the Meridian building at 6:30 in the evening, thinking about nothing in particular, and Igor was standing on the sidewalk. He looked smaller, which I know is a cliché, but is also exactly what happened. He'd always been physically large in a way that took up space in a room. Now he was just a man in a coat on a sidewalk, standing very still, waiting. I stopped. Тихо, без агрессии. Что-то было пережито. I just wanted to say, he started. I wanted to... He stopped. Started again. I didn't think it would go this way. I waited. The street was moving around us. People, cars, November cold, and we were a still point in it, the two of us. I thought we had something, he said. We did, I said. For a while. I was going to fix it, the business. I just needed time, I said. I know, and my apartment, and my signature on paperwork I didn't understand until Arkady explained it to me. He looked at me. Something crossed his face. Not exactly shame, but the recognition of shame. The awareness that he'd been seen fully, and that what was seen hadn't been good. I'm sorry, he said. I looked at him for a moment. Igor Menshov, who had been charming and optimistic and had remembered things and asked follow-up questions and had been underneath all of that, a man who saw the people around him primarily as resources. I know, I said, and I did believe him that he was sorry, in the particular way that people are sorry when things don't work out the way they intended. Whether that constituted actual remorse for the actual harm was a more complicated question, and one I didn't need the answer to. Igor, I said, I'm a financial controller. I find the number that doesn't belong. I've been doing it for 12 years. I should have done it sooner, but I did it. I pulled my coat tighter. The air was getting cold. I hope the next chapters are better for you. I genuinely do. I walked to my car. I didn't look back. Not from anger or from dramatic effect, but because I simply didn't need to. The gnomes were sold at auction. Arkady told me because he thought I'd want to know, and he was right. 348 of them. 64 had apparently been broken at some point during the inventory counting, at a price significantly below acquisition cost, purchased by a discount garden supply company in Saratov. I hope they found good homes. I hope there are gardens in Saratov that needed exactly this. 6 months later, on a Wednesday evening, I arrived at Lena's apartment for Scrabble, carrying a bottle of good wine and a box of those chocolate-covered figs. The four of us took our places. Polina sorted her tiles with her usual careful attention. Rita shuffled the bag. Lena had candles going because it was December and she believes in candles. We played. The apartment was warm and smelled like candles and Lena's cooking and the specific good smell of an evening with people you've known long enough to not need to perform for. At some point, I'd played Lucid for 16 points. Rita had thrown down Leverage, which earned a pointed look from all of us because Rita, Lena said, "You okay? Actually okay?" I thought about it. The east-facing windows in my apartment, catching the morning light without anyone else's opinion about them. The bracelet on my wrist. My father's voice saying, "She's done lending." The specific, absurd, cosmically correct image of 412 garden gnomes. "Yeah," I said. "Actually okay." "Good," said Polina, and placed Thrive on the board for 21 points. We played until midnight. The wine was good, the figs were excellent. Outside it snowed, quietly, without any particular comment on anything. And I drove home at 12:30 to my apartment with its east-facing windows and its very good locks and its total, complete, hard-won silence. I made tea. I sat by the window. The city was soft and white and mine. I put on the bracelet. I'd taken it off to drive, and I looked at the amber stone, the color of old light, of kept things, of the particular kind of love that gives you something real and asks only that you not sell it. My father had been right. I was the smartest person in my family. It had just taken me a little while to remember.